Imagine you have a splitting headache or a nasty cough that just will not go away. You reach for a painkiller or some cough syrup. It is simple, it is effective. Now imagine it is the year 1348. Your head is pounding, but there is no aspirin. Your chest rattles with every breath, but there are no over-the-counter remedies. Life expectancy is maybe 35 years old. The Black Death is sweeping across Europe, killing one in every 3 people. In a world without germ theory, without antibiotics, without even a basic understanding of anatomy, what did people do? How did they fight the fevers, infections, and aches of daily life? They did not just give up. They developed a complex and fascinating system of medicine. It was a mixture of ancient Greek philosophy, religious faith, folk wisdom, and sheer desperation. Some of their solutions were surprisingly insightful, planting seeds that would grow into modern medicine. Others were bizarre, dangerous, and based on ideas that seem utterly alien to us today. But they all tell a story. A story about the human struggle to understand our own bodies and to heal ourselves against overwhelming odds. Why did they think draining your blood could cure you? Could drilling a hole in your skull really release a demon? And what can these strange, ancient practices teach us about our own relationship with health, sickness, and the enduring quest for a cure? Number 16, could draining your blood really make you better? The answer, for over 2,000 years, was a resounding yes. If you walked into a physician's office any time from the 5th century BC to the late 19th century, there was a very good chance you would walk out a little lighter. Bloodletting was not a fringe treatment. It was the go-to solution for almost everything. Fever, let some blood. Headache, let some blood. Plague, pneumonia, melancholy, even a broken heart. The prescription was often the same. It was more common than any single drug we have today. The logic behind it was rooted in the ancient theory of the four humors. This idea, first proposed by the ancient Greeks like Hippocrates and later expanded by the Roman physician Galen, was the bedrock of Western medicine for millennia. The theory stated that the human body was composed of 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with an element: air, water, fire, earth, and a quality: hot, cold, moist, dry. A healthy person had these 4 humors in perfect balance. Sickness was simply an imbalance in excess of one humor over the others. Blood, the sanguine humor, was considered hot and moist. Many illnesses, especially those involving fever, redness, or inflammation, were diagnosed as a plethora or an overabundance of blood. The solution was obvious and direct. If you have too much of something, you get rid of the excess. You open a vein and let it drain out. It was a beautifully simple mechanical fix for a complex biological problem. The practice was performed by a wide range of people. Learned physicians would diagnose the need for bloodletting, but they rarely did the dirty work themselves. That task fell to barber surgeons. These were the jacks of all trades of medieval healthcare. They could cut your hair, pull a tooth, and drain your veins all in the same shop. The iconic red and white striped barber pole is a direct relic of this practice. The red symbolizes blood, and the white symbolizes the bandages. The pole itself represents the staff a patient would grip to make their veins bulge. There were several methods. The most common was venesection, which involved nicking a vein, typically in the elbow crease, with a small knife called a fleam. Physicians had detailed charts showing which vein corresponded to which part of the body. A vein in the right arm might be opened for liver problems, while one in the left might be for the spleen. Another method was scarification, making multiple small cuts with a special tool, often followed by cupping. A heated glass cup was placed over the cuts, and as it cooled, the vacuum created would draw the blood out. Leeches were also used, a form of bloodletting we will explore on its own. The amount of blood removed could be substantial. Accounts from the period describe draining several ounces, and sometimes pints, over the course of an illness. The famous case of King Charles II of England in 1685 is a stark example. When he suffered a seizure, his physicians subjected him to a barrage of treatments, starting with letting 16 ounces of blood from his arm. Over the next few days, they continued to bleed him, purge him, and give him bizarre concoctions. Well, he died, of course. A more modern analysis suggests he likely died of kidney failure, a condition made catastrophically worse by the severe dehydration caused by the bloodletting and purging. Perhaps the most famous American victim of bloodletting was George Washington. In 1799, he woke with a sore throat, which quickly worsened into a serious respiratory infection. His doctors, following the standard practice of the day, bled him heavily and repeatedly. Over the course of less than a day, they removed an estimated 3.75 liters of blood, which is about 40% of an adult's total blood volume. He died that night. While we cannot know for sure if he would have survived without the treatment, losing that much blood certainly turned a serious illness into a fatal one. So, was there ever any benefit to it? It is hard to say for certain. In very rare cases, it might have accidentally helped. For a patient with dangerously high blood pressure hypertensive crisis, reducing blood volume could temporarily lower pressure and relieve symptoms like a severe headache. This might have created a false feedback loop, convincing doctors it was working. There is also a rare genetic disorder called hemochromatosis, where the body absorbs too much iron. The primary modern treatment for this is phlebotomy, a controlled, sterile version of bloodletting. It is possible some medieval patients with this condition found relief from the practice. But for the vast majority of illnesses, bloodletting was actively harmful. It weakened already sick patients, put them at risk of infection from dirty instruments, and could induce shock and death. Its persistence was not due to its effectiveness, but to the immense authority of Galen and the ancient texts. For centuries, medical education was about memorizing the classics, not about empirical observation or challenging established doctrine. If a patient died, it was not because the treatment was wrong. It was because the illness was too severe. The theory was never questioned. It was not until the 19th century, with the rise of statistical analysis and clinical trials, that doctors like Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis in Paris began to systematically show that bloodletting was killing more patients than it was saving. Even then, the practice died a slow and stubborn death. The story of bloodletting is a sobering reminder of how a logical, elegant theory can lead medicine down a dangerous path for millennia. It raises some uncomfortable questions about our own time. If the brightest medical minds for 2,000 years could be so profoundly wrong about something so fundamental, what are we profoundly wrong about today? How much of a treatment's perceived success is due to the placebo effect and the sheer psychological power of a trusted authority figure performing a decisive action? And could a practice as common and accepted as taking a daily aspirin one day be seen with the same horrified disbelief we now reserve for the phlegm and the bleeding bowl? Bit number 15, was drilling a hole in your head a real medical procedure? Yes, it was. And it is one of the oldest surgical procedures known to humanity. It is called trepanation, and the evidence for it goes back like thousands of years before the medieval period to the Neolithic era. Archaeologists have found prehistoric skulls from Europe, Asia, and the Americas with perfectly round holes cut into them. The most remarkable thing about many of these skulls is the evidence of healing. Smooth, rounded bone growth around the edges of the hole proves that the person did not just survive the operation, they lived for weeks, months, or even years afterward. It was not just a ritual performed on the dead, it was a desperate, high-stakes surgery performed on the living. In the medieval period, trepanation continued to be a treatment of last resort. The reasons for performing it were varied. One of the primary motivations was to treat head injuries, particularly skull fractures from accidents or, more commonly, from warfare. If a soldier took a blow to the head from a mace or a sword, it could cause a depressed skull fracture, where a piece of bone is pushed inward, pressing on the brain. This could lead to swelling, bleeding, and increased intracranial pressure. The logic of trepanation in this context is surprisingly sound, even by modern standards. The surgeon would carefully cut away the broken fragments of bone and open a hole to relieve the pressure and allow the brain to swell without being crushed against the inside of the skull. This is conceptually similar to a modern craniotomy, but trepanation was not just for physical injuries. It was also used for ailments that were believed to originate inside the head. This included severe headaches, seizures, epilepsy, often called the falling sickness, and various forms of mental illness, described at the time as madness or demonic possession. The underlying belief was that these conditions were caused by a malevolent spirit or noxious vapor trapped inside the skull. Drilling a hole was seen as a way to create an escape route. It was a physical release for a spiritual or humoral problem. Let the demon out, let the bad air escape. The head would pound less, the fits would cease, the madness would subside. The procedure itself was gruesome. The patient would be held down, likely after being given alcohol or an herbal sedative like mandrake root or opium to dull the pain, though true anesthesia was non-existent. The surgeon would use a variety of tools. A simple drill called a gimlet might be used, or a circular saw-like instrument called a trephine, which was cranked by hand or with a bow. The surgeon had to be incredibly skilled and have a steady hand. The goal was to cut through the bone of the skull without piercing the dura mater, the tough membrane protecting the brain. One slip could be instantly fatal. Once the piece of bone, known as a roundel, was removed, the wound would be cleaned, perhaps with wine as a disinfectant, and then covered with a dressing of clean linen, honey, or a special herbal plaster. The most famous medieval surgeon to write about the procedure was Guy de Chauliac, a 14th century French physician who served several popes in Avignon. His monumental work, the Chirurgia Magna Great Surgery, became the standard surgical textbook for the next 200 years. He described in detail the indications for trepanation and the techniques for performing it safely. He recognized the dangers, warning surgeons to be extremely careful not to damage the brain. His work shows that, for all its brutality, this was not a haphazard butchery. It was a carefully considered procedure based on the best medical knowledge of the time. The survival rate is difficult to estimate, but the archaeological evidence of healed skulls proves that it was not always a death sentence. The risk of infection, however, was immense. Without an understanding of germs, even a technically perfect operation could be undone by a post-operative infection leading to meningitis or a brain abscess. Survival depended on the skill of the surgeon, the constitution of the patient, and a great deal of luck. As medicine progressed, trepanation for headaches or epilepsy fell out of favor, rightly recognized as ineffective and dangerous. The practice lingered in some folk traditions, but by the Renaissance it was mostly confined to treating physical head trauma. The idea of opening the skull to relieve pressure, however, never went away. It evolved. Today, neurosurgeons perform highly sophisticated procedures like decompressive craniectomies for traumatic brain injuries using sterile techniques, advanced imaging, and anesthesia. They remove a piece of skull to allow a swollen brain to expand, a direct, if distant, descendant of the medieval surgeon with his hand-cranked trephine. Trepanation forces us to confront the raw courage and desperation of both the patient and the surgeon in a pre-modern world. It sits on the unsettling line between medicine and magic, between a rational attempt to fix a physical problem and a ritual to expel a spiritual one. What does it tell us about the human mind that for thousands of years we have looked at a sealed-off skull and concluded that the solution to its internal problems is to open it up? How many suffering from treatable conditions like migraines were subjected to this terrifying procedure? And perhaps most disturbingly, when future generations look back at our own treatments for mental illness, from powerful psychotropic drugs to electroconvulsive therapy, will they see a sophisticated science, or will they see a modern, less bloody form of trepanation? Number 14, could your urine really tell a doctor what was wrong? In the Middle Ages, your urine was not just a waste product, it was a window to your soul, or at least to the inner workings of your body. A physician's visit would almost certainly involve a practice called uroscopy, the detailed examination of a patient's urine. Doctors, often called piss prophets, would hold a special flask-shaped glass called a matula up to the light, studying its contents with the intensity of a fortune teller gazing into a crystal ball. They did not just look, they sniffed it, they swirled it. In some cases, they even tasted it. This was not quackery, this was cutting-edge medical diagnostics. The practice was based on the humoral theory, just like bloodletting. The idea was that the body was like a cooking pot. Food was cooked in the stomach, and the byproducts were distributed throughout the body. The urine was seen as a filtrate of the blood, a substance that carried clear signs of the state of the humors. If your internal cooking process was off, the evidence would show up in the final product. To help them, physicians used elaborate urine wheels. These were circular charts, often beautifully illustrated in medical manuscripts that linked different colors, consistencies, and even sediments in the urine to specific diseases. The wheel might show 20 or more different shades, from a pale whitish like a goat's whey, to a clear citrus yellow, to a deep red, a green, or even a black. Each color pointed to a particular humoral imbalance. A reddish urine, for example, might suggest an excess of blood-sanguine humor and a fever. A pale, watery urine could indicate an excess of phlegm and a cold condition. But black urine was considered a terrible omen, often a sign of impending death. The analysis did not stop at color. The physician would also look for consistency, thick or thin, cloudiness, and the presence of sediment, foam, or particles. Each observation was a clue. Was the sediment at the top, middle, or bottom of the flask? Did it look like bran, or sand, or little clouds? All these details were fed into the complex diagnostic system of humoral pathology. And then there was the taste test. While it sounds disgusting to us, it was a vital diagnostic tool, especially for one particular condition. The ancient Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia had described a disease where patients urinated constantly and wasted away. He called it diabetes, from the Greek word for siphon. Later, physicians noted that the urine of these patients was strangely sweet. The 11th century Persian physician Avicenna, in his encyclopedic work The Canon of Medicine, described the sweet taste of diabetic urine, a sign he correctly associated with the disease. The medieval doctor who bravely tasted his patient's pee and found it sweet was performing the only available diagnostic test for what we now call diabetes mellitus. The mellitus part is Latin for honey sweet. Uroscopy became so central to the medical profession that the metulla, the urine flask, became the very symbol of the physician, much like the stethoscope is today. In art from the period, doctors are almost always depicted holding one up to the light. It was a symbol of their learning and their ability to see what was hidden from the ordinary eye. Of course, the system had its flaws. It was highly subjective. The interpretation of a particular shade of yellow could vary from one doctor to the next. And because the theory behind it was wrong, many of the conclusions were also wrong. A doctor might correctly note that a patient's urine was dark, but incorrectly conclude it was due to an excess of black bile causing melancholy, when it was actually a sign of severe dehydration or liver disease. The system also opened the door to fraud. Charlatans could make dramatic pronouncements based on a quick look at a flask, preying on the fears of the sick. By the late medieval period, there was a growing skepticism about the over-reliance on uroscopy, with some writers mocking the piss prophets, who claimed to know everything from a single sample. Despite its flawed theoretical basis, the fundamental idea behind uroscopy was brilliant. The concept that waste products from the body can provide vital clues about a person's health is the foundation of modern laboratory medicine. The medieval doctor's metulla and urine wheel have been replaced by the sterile plastic cup and the sophisticated machines of a urinalysis lab. Today, we analyze urine for protein, glucose, ketones, bacteria, and red and white blood cells. We can detect kidney disease, urinary tract infections, and diabetes with incredible precision. The medieval physicians were looking in the right place, they just lacked the tools and the scientific framework to understand what they were seeing. The practice of uroscopy is a testament to the power of observation. It shows a deep desire to find objective, physical evidence of disease, but it also shows how a powerful theory can shape and sometimes distort what we see. If the only available diagnostic test for a life-threatening disease for centuries involved tasting urine, how many other simple, effective, but perhaps disgusting diagnostic methods have we overlooked throughout history? What modern diagnostic tests, which we see as the height of sophistication, will be viewed in 500 years as a charmingly primitive and misguided ritual? And how much do our own preconceived theories about disease prevent us from seeing the simple clues our bodies are giving us every day? Number 13, could a potion made of dozens of ingredients cure anything? In a world plagued by mysterious illnesses and, most terrifyingly, by poison, there was a desperate need for a universal antidote, a master cure. The medieval world thought it had found one. It was called theriac, and it was not a simple herbal remedy. It was one of the most complex, expensive, and long-lived medicines in history. A single dose could contain over 60, 70, or even 80 different ingredients. The story of theriac begins long before the Middle Ages, in the ancient world. It was originally developed as an antidote to snakebite. The legendary creator was King Mithridates, the sixth upon us in the 1st century BC, a ruler so paranoid about being poisoned that he supposedly experimented on prisoners and took a small, daily dose of a complex mixture of poisons to build up his immunity. His secret formula, known as Mithridatium, was the prototype. After his defeat, the recipe was taken to Rome, where it was improved upon by Emperor Nero's personal physician, Andromachus. He added the flesh of vipers, believing that the creature that delivered the venom must also hold the key to its antidote. He called his new and improved formula Galene, but it became more widely known as theriac. The recipe was recorded by Galen, the great Roman physician whose works dominated medieval medicine. This gave theriac an unassailable stamp of authority. By the Middle Ages, it was produced in major cities like Venice, Constantinople, and Genoa, which controlled the lucrative trade routes for its exotic ingredients. This was not a simple kitchen remedy, this was a pharmaceutical blockbuster. The list of ingredients was staggering. It included common herbs like cinnamon, myrrh, and cardamom. But it also featured rare and expensive components from all corners of the known world: Arabian balsam, Indian ginger, and the mysterious terra sigillata, a special medicinal clay from a specific Greek island. The most crucial and famous ingredient, however, remained the viper's flesh. The snakes had to be caught at a specific time of year, prepared in a precise way, and then cooked and dried before being added to the mixture. And at the heart of it all was the single most powerful drug known to the pre-modern world: opium. The preparation of theriac was not a private affair. It was a public spectacle, a civic event that demonstrated a city's wealth and medical prowess. The ingredients would be displayed, their quality checked by officials, and then they would be pounded, mixed, and cooked in huge cauldrons in the town square, a process that could take days. The final product was a thick, dark, sticky paste with a potent smell. It was then left to age for months, or even years, like a fine wine. The older the theriac, the more powerful it was believed to be. Its uses were almost limitless. It was, first and foremost, the premier antidote for poison and venom, but its application quickly expanded. During the Black Death in the 14th century, plague doctors prescribed theriac as both a preventative and a cure. It was used for fevers, colic, digestive problems, and a host of other ailments. It was the ultimate cure-all. Wealthy individuals would carry a small, ornate box of it with them at all times, a personal emergency kit against the dangers of the world. Because of its expensive ingredients and complex manufacturing, it was also a status symbol. Only the rich could afford the best, aged theriac from Venice. The poor had to make do with cheaper, less effective local imitations. Did it work? The answer is complicated. As a universal antidote, almost certainly not. It could not neutralize a strong dose of arsenic or hemlock, but it was not completely useless. The key was the opium. Opium is a powerful painkiller, a cough suppressant, and it can slow the gut, which is useful for treating diarrhea. For a patient suffering from the painful symptoms of the plague, a dose of theriac would have provided significant relief from pain and anxiety. It would have made them feel better, even if it did not cure the underlying infection. This symptomatic relief would have been seen as a sign of its effectiveness. Many of the other herbal ingredients also had medicinal properties. Cinnamon is antimicrobial. Myrrh is anti-inflammatory. It was a classic example of polypharmacy, the idea of throwing dozens of ingredients at a problem in the hope that some of them will work. It was a shotgun approach to medicine, and sometimes, by pure chance, it hit the target. The belief in theriac was so strong that it persisted for centuries. It was listed in official pharmacopoeias well into the 18th and 19th centuries. The decline of theriac was not due to a single discovery that proved it wrong. It was a slow erosion caused by the rise of modern chemistry and a new way of thinking about medicine. Scientists began to isolate single active compounds from plants, like morphine from opium. The idea of a single complex cure-all was replaced by the search for a magic bullet, a specific drug for a specific disease. The shotgun was replaced by the rifle. Theriac represents a completely different philosophy of medicine, one of more is more. It raises questions about our own approach to complex illnesses. In our quest for single-target drugs, are we sometimes missing the potential benefits of synergistic combinations? The modern pharmaceutical industry is built on isolating single molecules, but what if some diseases are better treated with a cocktail of compounds, much like the original theriac? And what is the modern equivalent of theriac, a wildly popular and expensive treatment that we believe is highly effective, but which future generations will see as a complex, irrational, and largely ineffective concoction? Number 12. Could burning a wound shut be better than a bandage? In the brutal and often violent world of the Middle Ages, severe wounds were a common part of life. A fall from a horse, a mishap with a farm tool, or the slash of a sword in battle could leave a gaping, bleeding injury. With no understanding of bacteria or infection, an open wound was an open invitation to a slow and agonizing death. In this environment, doctors needed a quick, decisive way to stop bleeding and deal with damaged tissue. Their most dramatic and terrifying tool was cautery. Cauterization is the process of burning a part of the body to remove or close it off. Medieval surgeons used specially designed iron instruments, which were heated in a fire until they were red hot. These cauterizing irons came in various shapes and sizes, each designed for a specific purpose. There were pointed irons for puncturing abscesses, blade-like irons for amputations, and flat, circular irons for sealing surface wounds. The surgeon, with a strong stomach and a steady hand, would press the glowing metal directly onto the patient's flesh. The primary purpose of cautery was hemostasis, or the stopping of bleeding. For a major wound or an amputation, this was a matter of life and death. The intense heat of the iron would sear the blood vessel shut, instantly stopping the flow of blood. It was a brutal but effective method of hemorrhage control in an era before surgical ligatures. Tying off blood vessels with thread were widely or effectively used. The 10th century Arab surgeon Abu Qasis from Cordoba provided detailed illustrations of cauterizing irons and their uses in his influential surgical text, Al-Tasrif. He recommended it for a huge range of conditions, from nosebleeds to tumors. But cautery was thought to do more than just stop bleeding. Following the teachings of Galen, medieval medicine believed that the body produced different types of pus. A wound that produced thick white pus was considered to be healing well. This was called laudable pus. However, if a wound became infected and produced a thin, watery, foul-smelling discharge, it was a sign that the body was creating unlaudable pus, a sign of putrefaction. Well, cautery was seen as a way to combat this. The act of burning was believed to purify the wound, destroying the poisonous humors and preventing the spread of rot. By creating a dry, sterile eshar, a scab of burnt tissue, it sealed the wound from the supposedly corrupting influence of the outside air. Cautery was also used as a counter-irritant. For deep-seated pains like joint aches or sciatica, a physician might apply a hot iron to the skin over the affected area. The theory was that this would create a superficial burn, drawing the bad humors away from the deeper part of the body and out through the new opening. It was a way of fighting fire with fire, creating a new controlled injury to treat an old one. The procedure was, of course, excruciatingly painful. Patients had to be physically restrained. While some sedatives like opium were available, they were not powerful enough to block the searing agony of the hot iron. The smell of burning flesh would have filled the air. It was a last resort, a desperate measure for a desperate situation. The famous 16th century French military surgeon Ambroise Paré, often considered a father of modern surgery, initially followed the standard practice of treating gunshot wounds with boiling oil and cautery. However, during one battle, he ran out of oil and was forced to simply dress the wounds with a soothing ointment. To his astonishment, the soldiers he treated with the gentle ointment healed better and with less pain than those who had been cauterized. This discovery led him to abandon cautery in favor of ligatures to control bleeding, a major step forward in surgical practice. Despite its brutality, the core principle of cautery has survived into modern medicine, albeit in a much more refined and controlled form. Electrocautery, which uses a high-frequency electrical current to heat a small probe, is a standard tool in virtually every operating room today. Surgeons use it to cut tissue and to seal off tiny blood vessels with pinpoint precision, minimizing blood loss during surgery. It is faster and often safer than using sutures. Lasers are also used for a similar purpose, using focused light to burn or vaporize tissue. So, the fundamental idea of using heat to control bleeding and destroy tissue remains a cornerstone of modern surgery. The medieval surgeon's glowing poker has just been replaced by the surgeon's electric pen. Cauterization is a stark example of how a treatment can be both horrifying and in some ways effective. It highlights the brutal calculus of pre-anesthetic surgery, where immense pain was weighed against certain death. What does it say about the human capacity to endure suffering that people willingly submitted to such a procedure? If Ambroise Paré had not run out of boiling oil, how many more decades or even centuries would surgeons have continued to burn their patients' wounds? And does our modern, sterile, and painless use of electrocautery blind us to the fact that we are still, at a fundamental level, doing the same thing as the medieval barber surgeon, deliberately burning human flesh to achieve a medical goal? Number 11, could moldy bread really cure an infection? Imagine a cut on your hand from a rusty nail. Today you would wash it, put on a bandage, and maybe get a tetanus shot. You would not worry too much. In the Middle Ages, that same small cut could be a death sentence. Without any knowledge of bacteria, there was no way to effectively prevent or treat infection. A minor wound could quickly become red, swollen, and filled with pus, leading to fever, gangrene, and death. In this desperate fight against invisible invaders, people turned to folk remedies passed down through generations. One of the strangest and most prescient was the practice of applying moldy bread to an infected wound. This was not a treatment you would find in the scholarly texts of university-trained physicians. This was folk medicine, the practical wisdom of healers, midwives, and ordinary people. The logic is lost to time, but it was likely born of simple observation. Someone, somewhere, at some point, noticed that a wound treated with a poultice of moldy bread seemed to get better. The practice was recorded in various forms across different cultures, from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe. They had no idea why it worked. It just sometimes did. The science behind this folk remedy would not be uncovered until the 20th century. In 1928, the Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming was working in his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London. He returned from a holiday to find that one of his petri dishes, where he had been growing Staphylococcus bacteria, had been accidentally contaminated with a mold. He noticed something remarkable. In a clear circle around the mold, the bacteria had been killed. The mold was producing a substance that was lethal to the bacteria. He identified the mold as being from the Penicillium genus. He called the substance it produced penicillin. Fleming's discovery was the beginning of the antibiotic revolution, which would transform medicine and save countless millions of lives. The mold on his petri dish was a close relative of the common blue-green mold that grows on stale bread. The medieval healer who pressed moldy bread onto a wound was, in a sense, administering a crude, unpredictable, and non-standardized dose of an antibiotic. Of course, the medieval practice was a huge gamble. There are thousands of different species of mold. Only certain strains of penicillin produce the life-saving antibiotic. Others are useless, and some are actively toxic, capable of causing disease or even death. When a medieval person used moldy bread, they were playing a kind of biological roulette. They might be applying the one specific mold that could kill the bacteria infecting their wound. Or they might be making the situation much, much worse. The effectiveness would have also depended on the concentration of the penicillin-like substance produced by the mold, which would have varied wildly. It was an uncontrolled, unpurified application of a natural substance. But in a world with zero other options for fighting bacterial infections, even a 1 in 100 chance of success was better than nothing. It is a stunning example of how observation and tradition can sometimes stumble upon a profound medical truth, centuries before science can explain it. This was not the only example. Other natural substances used in folk medicine have been found to have antimicrobial properties. Honey, another common wound dressing in the ancient and medieval world, is known to have antibacterial effects due to its high sugar concentration, low pH, and the presence of hydrogen peroxide. Certain mosses, like sphagnum moss, were used to pack wounds on the battlefield. We now know that sphagnum moss is highly absorbent and has antiseptic properties. The story of moldy bread is a powerful lesson in the value of looking for medicine in unexpected places. It shows that effective treatments can be hidden in plain sight, dismissed as old wives' tales. Modern medicine is increasingly turning back to nature in the search for new drugs, a field known as bioprospecting. Scientists are examining soil samples, deep sea sponges, and traditional herbal remedies from around the world, looking for the next penicillin. They are, in a way, doing what our medieval ancestors did, observing the natural world and trying to unlock its healing secrets. The accidental genius of using moldy bread is both humbling and astonishing. It forces us to ask how many other effective folk remedies were lost to history, dismissed as superstition before they could be scientifically validated. What life-saving compound might be lurking in a common weed or a household fungus that we are currently ignoring? And if a simple observation about mold could hold the key to one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in history, what other simple, everyday observations are we failing to make that could solve the medical crises of our own time? At number 10, did people really plan surgery based on the stars? Absolutely. For a medieval physician, the human body was not an isolated biological machine. It was a microcosm, a miniature reflection of the universe. The macrocosm, the movements of the sun, moon, and planets were believed to have a direct and powerful influence on a person's health and fortune. This meant that medicine and astrology were not separate fields. They were deeply intertwined. You could not be a fully qualified physician without a good working knowledge of the stars. The central figure in this system was the zodiac man, or Homo Signorum. This was a diagram found in countless medical manuscripts that showed a human figure with the 12 signs of the zodiac superimposed on the parts of the body they were believed to rule. The system was highly specific. Aries, the ram, ruled the head. Taurus, the bull, governed the neck and throat. Gemini, the twins, controlled the arms and shoulders. The rulership continued down the body, all the way to Pisces, the fish, which governed the feet. This was not just a charming illustration, it was a practical working guide for diagnosis and treatment. A pain in the leg, for instance, might be related to the influence of Aquarius, which ruled the shins and ankles. But the most important application of the Zodiac Man was in scheduling medical procedures, especially bloodletting and surgery. The core rule was to never, under any circumstances, treat a part of the body when the moon was in the zodiac sign that ruled it. The moon's position was thought to draw the humors toward that part of the body, making it vulnerable. To cut into the leg when the moon was in Aquarius, for example, would be to invite disaster. It would lead to excessive bleeding, poor healing, or the intervention of malevolent celestial influences. So, a medieval surgeon or physician would need more than just a scalpel and a knowledge of Galen. They would need an almanac, an ephemeris, a table of planetary positions, and an astrolabe to calculate the positions of the celestial bodies. Before scheduling a procedure, they would cast a chart, they would check the position of the moon. They would also look at the positions of other planets, especially the malefics Mars and Saturn, whose influences were considered harmful. The ideal time for surgery was when the celestial signs were favorable, when the moon was in a good sign and not afflicting the part of the body in question. This practice shows a fundamentally different worldview. We see disease as a result of pathogens, genetics, or internal system failures. They saw it as a result of imbalance, not just within the body, but between the body and the cosmos. A person was not sick in isolation. They were sick as part of a universal system of correspondences. His health was about maintaining harmony with the heavens. The belief was so widespread that it was a core part of university medical education. The universities of Bologna, Padua, and Paris all taught medical astrology as a required subject. The 14th century physician John of Ardern wrote that a surgeon must know the principles of astrology, for doctors who are ignorant of astrology are like a blind man with a stick. The influential 17th century herbalist and physician Nicholas Culpeper fully integrated astrology into his work, assigning planetary rulers to plants as well as to diseases. For him, a plant ruled by Mars would be good for treating a disease caused by the influence of Venus, as the two planets were opposites. Was there any scientific basis for this? None whatsoever. The gravitational pull of the moon and planets is far too weak to have any measurable effect on human physiology. The zodiac signs are constellations whose stars are light years away and have no connection to the parts of the human body. The entire system was based on analogy and symbolism, not empirical evidence. However, the practice of waiting for an auspicious time might have had an unintended and very slight benefit. By forcing doctors to pause and consider a procedure, it may have prevented some hasty and ill-advised surgeries. It introduced a cooling-off period. A patient who was very ill might recover on their own in the days spent waiting for the moon to move into a better position, saving them from a dangerous operation. But, on the whole, the system was pure superstition, a complex and intellectually rigorous system built on a false premise. It is a powerful example of how intelligent people can create elaborate, logical systems that have no connection to reality. The Zodiac Man is a fascinating glimpse into a mind that saw connections everywhere. It represents a search for order and meaning in a chaotic and unpredictable world. You know, what does it say about us that we still read our horoscopes, even if just for fun, tapping into that same ancient desire to find a link between our personal lives and the vastness of the cosmos? If the most learned people for centuries based life and death medical decisions on the position of the moon, what widely accepted environmental factor in our own time will be seen as pure superstition by future generations. And could the rigid, scheduled nature of astrological medicine have created a powerful placebo effect, convincing patients they are being treated at the most perfect, divinely ordained moment? Number 9. Was it possible to transfer your sickness to an animal or an object? The medieval world was a place where the lines between the physical and the magical were blurry. People believed in a concept known as sympathetic magic. This was the idea that there was a hidden connection, a sympathy, between things that looked alike or had been in contact with each other. This belief system offered a unique and bizarre approach to healing. You could transfer your illness to something else. The principle was simple. If you had a fever, you could try to pass it on to a tree. If you had a wart, you could rub it with a piece of meat and then bury the meat. As the meat rotted away in the ground, your wart would wither and disappear. The illness was not seen as a malfunction of the body, but as a separate entity, a magical intrusion that could be coaxed or tricked into leaving your body and inhabiting another object, animal, or even another person. This type of folk medicine was practiced all over Europe. The cures were highly specific and often involved elaborate rituals. For a fever, one common prescription was to go to a willow tree, tie a knot in one of its branches, and recite an incantation binding your fever to the tree. Another cure for a fever involved writing a magical charm on a piece of paper or bread and feeding it to a dog. The dog would then carry the fever away. Gout, a painful joint disease, could be treated by cutting the nails of the afflicted person, mixing them with wax, and sticking the mixture into a hole bored in an oak tree. The hole would then be plugged. The gout was now trapped in the tree. To cure jaundice, a patient might be told to look at a yellow-colored bird, like a yellowhammer. The belief was that the yellow color of the disease would be drawn out of the patient's skin and eyes and into the bird. The patient would recover, but the bird would die. These practices were based on two main principles of sympathetic magic, as later defined by anthropologists like Sir James Frazer in his work The Golden Bough. The first is the law of similarity, which states that produces an image or an object that resembles something has a real connection to it. This is the logic behind sticking pins in a voodoo doll. The second is the law of contagion, which states that things that have once been in contact continue to act on each other at a distance. This is why a person's hair, nails, or a piece of their clothing could be used in a spell. These items contain a part of their essence. So when a person with a wart rubbed it with a piece of meat, the meat became contaminated with the essence of the wart through the law of contagion. When the meat was buried and decayed, the wart, linked by similarity, also decayed. It was a logical, step-by-step process within a magical framework. Of course, from a modern medical perspective, this is pure superstition. There is no physical mechanism by which an illness can be transferred to a tree or a piece of rotting meat. So why did these beliefs persist? One reason is the power of the placebo effect. The act of performing a specific, meaningful ritual can have a profound psychological impact, which can in turn have real physiological effects, such as reducing stress or modulating the perception of pain. If you truly believe that burying a piece of meat will cure your wart, your belief might trigger your body's own healing mechanisms. Another reason is that many common ailments, like warts and fevers from minor viral infections, are self-limiting. They go away on their own. If you perform a magical ritual and then your wart disappears a few weeks later, you will naturally conclude that the ritual worked. This creates a powerful confirmation bias. You remember the successes and forget the failures. These types of beliefs were not limited to the uneducated peasantry. While university-trained physicians focused on humoral theory, many still acknowledged the power of charms and amulets. The lines were not always clear. A doctor might prescribe a complex herbal medicine based on Galenic principles, but also advise the patient to wear a specific gemstone to ward off bad influences. The official church was often hostile to what it saw as pagan magic, but the beliefs were deeply ingrained in the popular culture and proved impossible to stamp out. The practice of sympathetic magic reveals a deep human need to actively do something in the face of illness. It is a way of taking control, of fighting back against a mysterious and frightening force. It makes us wonder, what are the modern equivalents of burying the meat to cure the wart? How many wellness trends, fad diets, or alternative therapies are based on a similar kind of magical thinking, where we perform a ritual in the hope of transferring our impurities or toxins to something else? And is it possible that the power of a ritual, completely divorced from its supposed physical mechanism, has a genuine therapeutic value that scientific medicine has been too quick to dismiss? Number 8, could praying to the right saint heal a specific body part? In the deeply religious world of the Middle Ages, medicine and faith were inseparable. Sickness was often seen not just as a physical ailment, but as a spiritual trial, a punishment for sin, or a test from God. While people sought help from physicians and folk healers, they also turned to a higher power for intervention. And often that intervention was sought from a very specific celestial address, a patron saint. There was a vast and highly specialized roster of saints who were believed to have influence over particular diseases and body parts. This was, in a way, a form of spiritual specialization. If you had a toothache, you did not just offer a generic prayer for healing. You prayed specifically to Saint Apollonia. She was a 3rd century martyr who during her persecution, had all her teeth violently pulled out. Because of the nature of her suffering, she was believed to have a special sympathy and intercessory power for anyone suffering from dental problems. The list of these heavenly specialists was long. Saint Blaise, a bishop whose throat was pierced during his martyrdom, was the patron saint of throat ailments. If you had a sore throat or had something caught in your windpipe, you would pray to him. And Saint Lawrence, who was martyred by being roasted alive on a gridiron, became the patron saint of burns and back pain. For eye problems, one would turn to Saint Lucy, whose eyes were gouged out before her execution. The unfortunate Saint Erasmus, or Saint Elmo, whose intestines were wound out of his body on a windlass, was invoked for stomach cramps and intestinal disorders. And for the embarrassing but common problem of hemorrhoids, the patron was Saint Fiacre, an Irish hermit, who was said to have been miraculously cured of them after sitting on a holy stone. This system offered a powerful sense of comfort and control. In a world of random suffering, it provided a clear course of action. You had a specific problem, and there was a specific saint who understood that problem intimately. The act of praying was often accompanied by a pilgrimage to a shrine containing the saint's relics, a bone, a piece of clothing, or some other object associated with them. These shrines were major centers of healing. The sick would travel for days or weeks to reach them. They would touch the reliquary, leave offerings, and pray for a miracle. The walls of these shrines were often covered with ex-votos, small models of the afflicted body, part a leg, an arm, an eye, left as a token of thanks by those who believed they had been cured. Was this effective medicine? From a scientific standpoint, no. There is no evidence that praying to a specific saint can cure a specific disease. But to dismiss it as mere superstition is to miss the point. The power of this system lay in its profound psychological and social effects. First, it provided hope in desperate situations. For diseases that earthly physicians could not cure, the saints offered a last resort. This hope could have a powerful placebo effect, reducing stress and anxiety, which are known to have a negative impact on the immune system. Second, the act of pilgrimage itself could be therapeutic. It involved physical exertion, a change of scenery, and a break from the routine of daily life. At the shrine, the sick person was no longer isolated. They were part of a community of fellow sufferers, all sharing the same hope. This social support is a crucial component of healing. Third, the shrines were often located near natural springs or wells, whose waters were believed to have healing properties. While not magical, the water might have been cleaner than the local water supply, or it could have contained minerals that had a mild therapeutic effect. The practice of seeking spiritual intervention for healing is of course not limited to the medieval period. It is a fundamental part of many religions and cultures around the world today. People still make pilgrimages to places like Lourdes in France, hoping for a miraculous cure. Many modern hospitals have chapels and employ chaplains, recognizing that a patient's spiritual well-being is an important part of their overall health. The specialization of the saints is a fascinating mirror of the specialization of modern medicine. Just as we go to a cardiologist for a heart problem and a dermatologist for a skin problem, the medieval person went to St. Lawrence for a burn and St. Apollonia for a toothache. This raises an interesting question. Does the human mind have an innate need to categorize and assign specific solutions to specific problems, whether that solution is a saint or a medical specialist? How much of the healing that occurred at medieval shrines was a result of the journey, the community, and the profound power of belief, rather than any divine intervention? And in our secular scientific age, have we lost something valuable by separating the healing of the body from the healing of the spirit? Number 7, could a special diet and lifestyle keep you healthy? While medieval medicine is often remembered for its dramatic and bloody interventions like bloodletting and cautery, there was a quieter, more holistic side to it. This was the concept of regimen, a personalized program of diet, exercise, and lifestyle choices designed to maintain the balance of the humors and prevent illness from occurring in the first place. This was the medieval version of preventative medicine. The foundation for this was a set of principles known as the 6 non-naturals. This rather strange name did not mean they were supernatural. It meant they were 6 factors that were not innate to the human body, like the humors, but which were essential to life and under a person's control. A physician's job was not just to cure sickness, but to advise his wealthy patients on how to manage these 6 things to stay healthy. The 6 non-naturals were the air you breathe, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, evacuation and repletion. the body's processes of excretion and retention, and the passions of the soul emotions. The goal was to keep all of these in moderation and in harmony with a person's individual constitution. A person's constitution was determined by their dominant humor. A sanguine person dominated by blood was naturally hot and moist. A choleric person, yellow bile, was hot and dry. A melancholic person, black bile, was cold and dry. And a phlegmatic person, phlegm, was cold and moist. The key to health was to choose a lifestyle that counteracted any potential excess in your dominant humor. The diet was the most important part of regimen. Foods were also classified by their humoral qualities. A choleric person who was already hot and dry would be advised to avoid hot and dry foods like pepper, garlic, and roasted meats. They would be encouraged to eat cold and moist foods like cucumbers, melons, and fish. A phlegmatic person who was cold and moist would be told to do the opposite, eating warming foods like ginger and onions and avoiding watery vegetables. The way food was prepared also mattered. Boiling was considered to be a moistening cooking method, while roasting was drying. This was not just about general health. Specific diets were prescribed for specific ailments. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a famous medical poem from the great medical school of Salerno in Italy, is full of this kind of advice. If you have a fever, take a little broth. If you are constipated, eat cabbage. It was a complex system of matching the properties of food to the state of the body. The other non-naturals were just as important. The quality of the air was crucial. Physicians advised the wealthy to build their homes away from swamps and marshes, whose miasmatic or corrupt air was believed to cause disease. This was an incorrect theory. They blamed the smell, not the mosquitoes, but it led to a correct conclusion: living near stagnant water is unhealthy. Exercise, or motion and rest, had to be balanced. Too much rest would lead to a buildup of sluggish humors. Too much motion could overheat the body. Gentle activities like walking or horseback riding were encouraged. Sleep was seen as essential for restoring the body. The passions of the soul were also critical. Extreme emotions like anger, grief, or even excessive joy could throw the humors out of balance. A physician would advise his patient to cultivate a calm and moderate emotional life. This personalized holistic approach to health was, for the most part, only available to the rich. Only they had the time and resources to worry about the quality of their air, to afford a varied diet, and to hire a physician to give them a bespoke lifestyle plan. The peasants' diet was determined by what was available, and their life was one of hard physical labor, regardless of their humoral constitution. While the humoral theory that underpinned the system of regimen was wrong, much of the advice it generated was surprisingly good. Eating a balanced diet with plenty of fruits and vegetables, getting moderate exercise, ensuring enough sleep, avoiding polluted areas, and managing stress are all cornerstones of modern public health advice. The medieval physicians arrived at these sensible conclusions for the wrong theoretical reasons, but the practical advice was often sound. The medieval concept of regimen shows a sophisticated understanding that health is not just the absence of disease, but a product of our daily choices. It is a powerful reminder that preventative medicine is not a modern invention. If the humoral theory was the operating system, and the advice was the application, how is it that a faulty system could produce such a sensible program? How much of modern wellness advice, from juice cleanses to specific superfoods, is just a new version of the old humoral system, classifying foods as good or bad based on a fashionable theory rather than hard science? And have we, in our focus on drugs and surgery to treat established diseases, lost some of the wisdom of this older, more holistic approach to staying well in the first place? Number 6, could honey and wine really heal a wound? In the medieval world, a deep cut was a crisis. The immediate threat was bleeding to death. But if you survived that, the next great enemy was infection. With no concept of germs, wound care was a mixture of practical experience and theoretical dogma. Two of the most common substances applied to wounds were wine and honey. To our modern sensibilities, this might sound more like the makings of a pleasant drink than a medical treatment. But this ancient practice held a surprising amount of scientific validity. Wine was used as a cleaning agent. Surgeons would wash out wounds with it and use it to soak the linen bandages they applied. The logic came straight from the ancient authorities like Hippocrates and Galen. They taught that wine had a warming and drying quality, which was considered ideal for helping a wound to close and for preventing the buildup of bad humors that led to putrefaction. The famous parable of the Good Samaritan in the Bible describes the Samaritan treating the beaten man's wounds by pouring in oil and wine. This shows that the practice was ancient and widespread. The medieval physicians did not know why it worked, but we do. Wine contains alcohol, typically between 10 and 15%. Alcohol is a powerful antiseptic. It kills bacteria and other microbes by denaturing their proteins and dissolving their lipid membranes. By washing a wound with wine, a medieval surgeon was unknowingly disinfecting it, dramatically reducing the number of bacteria that could cause a deadly infection. It was a primitive but effective form of antisepsis, centuries before Joseph Lister would pioneer the use of carbolic acid in surgery. Of course, its effectiveness would depend on the strength of the wine, and it would have stung terribly, but it was far better than washing a wound with contaminated water or leaving it to fester. Honey was another staple of the medieval wound care kit. It was often used as a dressing, smeared directly onto the wound or on the bandage that covered it. Like wine, its use was ancient, documented by the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. Its medical rationale was based on its humoral properties, but its true effectiveness lies in its unique chemical and physical properties. First, honey is a supersaturated solution of sugar. This creates a powerful osmotic effect. When honey is placed on a wound, it draws water out of the surrounding tissues. It also draws water out of any bacteria that are present, dehydrating them and killing them. It essentially creates a dry environment where microbes cannot thrive. Second, honey is acidic, with a pH typically between 3.2 and 4.5. This acidity is inhospitable to most bacteria, which prefer a more neutral environment. Third, when honey comes into contact with the fluid seeping from a wound, an enzyme in the honey called glucose oxidase slowly produces small, steady amounts of hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is a well-known antiseptic, so a honey dressing is continuously producing its own disinfectant right where it is needed. This is a much gentler and more effective mechanism than simply pouring a harsh chemical on a wound. Finally, honey is viscous and sticky, creating a physical barrier that protects the wound from outside contamination while keeping it moist, which is now known to be beneficial for healing. There is now a significant body of modern scientific research that has confirmed the powerful antimicrobial and wound healing properties of honey. Specialized medical-grade honey, particularly Manuka honey from New Zealand, is now used in hospitals around the world to treat difficult wounds, burns, and ulcers, especially those infected with antibiotic-resistant bacteria like Myceta. The medieval healer's pot of honey has found its way back into the modern clinic. The use of wine and honey is a stunning example of how ancient remedies, developed through centuries of trial and error, can be proven effective by modern science. It makes one wonder how many other simple natural substances hold powerful healing properties that we have yet to rediscover. If people use these effective treatments for thousands of years without understanding the science, what does that say about the relationship between practical wisdom and theoretical knowledge? And in our modern world of powerful, targeted antibiotics, is there a risk that we will forget the value of these broader, multi-pronged natural antiseptics, especially as we face a growing crisis of antibiotic resistance? Number 5, could leeches actually be a medical tool? Of all the images associated with medieval medicine, the leech is one of the most enduring and unsettling. The idea of deliberately applying these blood-sucking worms to one's body seems like the stuff of horror movies. But for centuries, hydrotherapy, or the use of leeches for medical purposes, was a mainstream practice. The leeches were, in essence, a specialized tool for bloodletting. The leech used for medicine was a specific species, Hirudo medicinalis. These were not just any pond leech, they were carefully farmed and sold by apothecaries. A physician would diagnose an excess of blood, just as they would for regular venesection, but would prescribe leeches for areas that were difficult or delicate to cut with a lancet, such as the face, the gums, or near the eye. They were also seen as a gentler method of blood removal, more suitable for children or frail patients. The procedure involved placing the leeches on the targeted area of skin. If the leech was reluctant to bite, the skin might be pricked to draw a drop of blood or sweetened with milk or sugar. Once attached, the leech would bite down with its 3-bladed jaw, which contains hundreds of tiny teeth. The bite itself is not very painful, often described as similar to a mosquito bite. The leech would then begin to draw blood, its body swelling as it fed. A single leech can consume up to 10 times its body weight in blood, about 5 to 15 milliliters. After about 30 to 60 minutes, the engorged leech would simply fall off. But the most medically significant part of the process happens in the leech's saliva. As it bites, the leech injects a complex cocktail of biologically active substances into the wound. The most famous of these is a powerful anticoagulant called hirudin. This substance stops the blood from clotting, allowing the leech to feed uninterrupted. But it also means that after the leech detaches, the small wound continues to bleed or weep for several hours. This post-leech bleeding was considered part of the treatment as it removed even more of the bad blood. The use of leeches peaked in the 19th century, especially in France, where leech mania led to the importation of tens of millions of leeches a year to meet medical demand. The species was almost harvested to extinction. Like other forms of bloodletting, the practice fell out of favor with the collapse of humoral theory and the rise of scientific medicine. But then, in the 20th century, the leech made a remarkable comeback. In the 1970s and 80s, plastic and reconstructive surgeons began to face a new problem. They had become incredibly skilled at reattaching severed fingers, ears, and other body parts. They could painstakingly stitch the tiny arteries back together, getting fresh, oxygenated blood flowing into the reattached part. The problem was with the veins. The tiny, fragile veins were much harder to reconnect. This meant that while arterial blood could get in, the venous blood could not get out effectively. The reattached part would become engorged with stagnant, deoxygenated blood, a condition called venous congestion. The pressure would build, the tissue would be starved of oxygen, and the reattachment would fail. The surgeons rediscovered the medicinal leech. By applying leeches to the congested area, they could remove the excess pooled blood. But more importantly, the hirudin in the leech's saliva would keep the wound bleeding for hours, creating a channel for the stagnant blood to drain away. This buys precious time, keeping the tissue alive for the days it takes for the body to grow new, functioning veins. The leech acts as a temporary living drainage system. Today, leeches are an FDA-approved medical device. They are raised in sterile, controlled environments and are used in hospitals around the world, particularly in microsurgery to salvage reattached digits and skin flaps. The medieval apothecary's jar of leeches has found a new, highly specific, and life-saving niche in the modern operating room. The story of the leech is perhaps the most dramatic example of an ancient remedy being reborn as a modern medical tool. It shows that even the strangest and most reviled practices can contain a kernel of profound biological truth. If leeches, once a symbol of medical ignorance, are now saving fingers and limbs in advanced surgical units, what other quack remedies might be hiding powerful and useful biochemical secrets? How does the natural world, in this case a humble worm, produce a substance like hirudin that is more effective than many synthetic anticoagulants? And does the revival of the leech challenge our linear view of medical progress, suggesting that sometimes the path forward involves looking back? Number 4, how did you fix a broken bone without a cast? In a world without cars, there were no high-speed traffic accidents, but life was still physically demanding and dangerous. People fell from ladders, were kicked by horses, or were injured in brawls and on the battlefield. Broken bones were a common and serious injury. Without the benefit of x-rays, anesthesia, or modern plaster casts, how did medieval practitioners deal with fractures? The answer is with a surprising degree of skill and ingenuity. The job of fixing broken bones fell to a specialist known as a bone setter. This was often a craft passed down through families, a practical skill learned through apprenticeship rather than formal university education. While learned physicians wrote about the theory of fractures, the hands-on work was done by these experienced practitioners. The first step was diagnosis. The bone setter would have to rely entirely on their senses of sight and touch. They would examine the limb for obvious deformities, swelling, and bruising. They would carefully feel along the bone, searching for the telltale grating sound and sensation of broken bone ends rubbing against each other, a sign known as crepitus. They had to determine if it was a simple, clean break or a more dangerous compound fracture, where the broken bone had pierced the skin. A compound fracture was often a death sentence due to the high risk of infection. The next step was reduction, the process of setting the bone back into its proper alignment. This was agonizingly painful. The patient would be held down by several strong assistants. The bone setter would then use traction, pulling on the end of the limb to overcome the powerful muscle spasms that were pulling the bone fragments out of alignment. Once the muscles were stretched, the bone setter would use their hands to manipulate the fragments back into place. And they would listen and feel for a click or clunk that signaled the bone was realigned. Once the bone was set, it had to be immobilized to allow it to heal. This is where the medieval equivalent of a cast came in. The bone setter would create a splint. These were made from strips of wood, leather, or even whalebone, which were padded with soft linen or moss to prevent pressure sores. The splints would be placed around the limb and then bound tightly with linen bandages. To make the bandage even more rigid, it would often be stiffened with a variety of substances. A common mixture was egg whites and flour, which would dry into a hard, supportive shell. Other recipes called for wax, resin, or special clays. This was, in essence, a primitive form of the modern plaster cast. The great Arab surgeon Abulcasis described this technique, and later European surgeons like Guy de Chauliac also detailed the use of splints and stiffened bandages. The limb would then be placed in a sling or elevated on pillows. The healing process was long and required patience. The bone setter would check on the patient regularly, sometimes loosening the bandages to check for swelling or signs of infection. The patient would be confined to bed for weeks or months. Healing a major fracture like a femur could take the better part of a year. The results were variable. If the bone setter was skilled and the fracture was simple, a patient could make a full recovery with a strong, well-healed bone. But complications were common. If the bone was not set perfectly, it could heal in a shortened or crooked position, leaving the person with a permanent limp or deformity. If the bandages were too tight, they could cut off circulation, leading to tissue death or gangrene. And the ever-present threat of infection, especially with compound fractures, meant that even a well-set bone could lead to a fatal illness. Despite the risks, the techniques of the medieval bone setter, reduction, immobilization, and patience, are the fundamental principles of modern orthopedics. Today, an orthopedic surgeon uses an X-ray to see the fracture, anesthesia to prevent pain, and internal fixation with metal plates and screws for complex breaks. But the basic goal is the same as the bone setters: put the pieces back where they belong and hold them still until they heal. The work of the bone setter is a testament to the power of practical, hands-on knowledge. It shows that effective medicine can develop outside of formal academic institutions. How did these practitioners, without the ability to see inside the body, develop such a refined sense of touch and an intuitive understanding of mechanics? Given the immense pain involved, what does the process of setting a bone tell us about the medieval relationship with and tolerance for pain? And as modern medicine becomes increasingly reliant on technology and imaging, is there a risk that we are losing the fundamental hands-on clinical skills that define the work of the old bone setters? Number 3, could a plant that looks like a liver really cure liver disease? The medieval world was a green world. For the vast majority of people, the local plants were the only pharmacy they had. Herbalism was not alternative medicine, it was the main form of medicine. Healers, monks, and ordinary households all cultivated and used a wide variety of medicinal plants. But how did they know which plant to use for which ailment? One of the most fascinating and strangest guiding principles was a theory known as the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures was the belief that God had marked his creation with clues, or signatures, to show humanity how to use it. A plant's appearance in its shape, color, or habitat was a divine signpost pointing to its medicinal purpose. It was a form of as above, so below, a belief that the appearance of a plant mirrored a part of the human body or a symptom of a disease, and therefore could be used to treat it. The examples are numerous and often poetic. The plant hepatica, also known as liverwort, has leaves that are shaped like the lobes of a human liver. Therefore, it was believed to be a cure for liver ailments. Eyebright, a small flower with markings that look a bit like a bloodshot eye, was used to treat eye infections. The crinkled, brain-like appearance of a walnut meant that it was good for the brain, used to treat headaches and improve intelligence. Lungwort has spotted leaves that were thought to resemble a diseased lung, making it the go-to remedy for respiratory problems. The logic extended beyond shape. The yellow sap of the celandine plant was used to treat jaundice, a condition that turns the skin yellow. Red-colored plants and juices like beetroot were thought to be good for the blood. Plants with a scaly texture might be used for skin diseases. Even the plant's environment was a clue. The willow trees grow in damp, marshy ground. The doctrine of signature suggested they would be good for treating rheumatic aches and pains, which were associated with dampness and cold. This way of thinking was systematized by writers like the 16th century Swiss physician and alchemist Paracelsus, but its roots are much older, found in folk traditions across the world. It was an intuitive, analogical way of making sense of the vast and confusing world of plants. It provided a simple, memorable system for organizing and transmitting herbal knowledge in a pre-literate society. It is much easier to remember that the liver-shaped leaf is for the liver than it is to memorize a long list of abstract properties. Was there any truth to it? For the most part, no. The shape of a leaf has no causal connection to its biochemical properties. Most of the cures, based on the doctrine of signatures, were ineffective. Liverwort does not cure liver disease, and walnuts do not make you smarter, though they are healthy food. However, by sheer coincidence, the doctrine sometimes pointed in the right direction. The most famous example is the willow tree. The belief that it could treat the damp pains of rheumatism turned out to be correct. The bark of the willow tree is a rich source of a substance called salicin. In the 19th century, scientists isolated salicin and converted it into salicylic acid and then into acetylsalicylic acid. In 1897, the Bayer Company in Germany marketed this new drug under the trade name aspirin. It became one of the most successful and widely used drugs in human history, a powerful pain reliever, anti-inflammatory, and fever reducer. The medieval herbalist, following a magical theory, had stumbled upon one of nature's most powerful medicines. This shows the complex interplay of theory and observation. The doctrine of signatures was the theory, a wrong one. But the practical experience of herbalists passed down through generations had also noted that willow bark tea really did seem to help with aches and fevers. The magical doctrine was likely a way of explaining and remembering an observed real-world effect. The doctrine of signatures is a beautiful example of the human mind's search for patterns and meaning in nature. It represents a belief in an ordered, benevolent universe where the cures for our ills are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be decoded. If a completely wrong theory like this could occasionally lead to a correct and powerful medicine like aspirin, how many other valid observations are currently wrapped up in theories that we have dismissed as nonsensical? What hidden signatures in nature are we failing to see because we are locked into our own modern scientific frameworks? And does this ancient doctrine challenge us to look at the world with fresh eyes, to see not just a random collection of plants, but a web of potential connections and meanings? Number 2, could a woman's health problems be caused by a wandering womb? For thousands of years, from ancient Greece through the medieval period and beyond, medicine had a profound and often bizarre misunderstanding of the female body. Many of a woman's health issues, from anxiety and shortness of breath to fainting spells and seizures, were blamed on a single mobile culprit, the womb. The theory of the wandering womb, or hysteria, proposed that the uterus was not a fixed organ, but a restless creature, an animal within an animal, that could become dislodged and travel around the body, causing chaos wherever it went. The root of this idea is ancient. The Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia described the womb as being exceedingly delighted with fragrant smells and advances towards them, and it has an aversion to fetid smells and flees from them. If the womb became dry or light, perhaps due to a lack of sexual intercourse, it would begin to wander, searching for moisture. If it traveled upward, it would press on the diaphragm and lungs, causing a feeling of suffocation or choking, the classic symptom of what was called the hysterical passion. It could press on the heart, causing palpitations, or on the brain, causing seizures or fainting. The treatments were designed to lure the womb back to its proper place. This was done by appealing to its supposed sense of smell. Sweet-smelling perfumes, herbs, and fumigations would be applied to the woman's vagina to entice the womb to come back down. At the same time, foul-smelling and disgusting substances, like burnt hair or castor oil, would be held to the woman's nose to drive the wandering organ downward, away from the bad smells. This theory was a central part of women's medicine in the medieval period, transmitted through the writings of Galen and other classical authors. The Trocula, a famous 12th century collection of texts on women's health from the medical school of Salerno, discusses the suffocation of the womb and its treatments. The problem was, seen as particularly common in virgins, nuns, and widows, women who were not engaging in regular sexual activity, which was believed to keep the womb moistened and content in its proper place. The prescribed cure, in many cases, was marriage and regular intercourse. From a modern anatomical perspective, this is of course complete fantasy. The uterus is firmly anchored in the pelvis by strong ligaments and cannot travel around the body. The theory of the wandering womb is a powerful example of how a lack of direct anatomical knowledge, combined with deeply ingrained cultural biases about women, could lead to a durable and harmful medical myth. The term hysteria itself comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera. The theory effectively medicalized and pathologized female emotions and sexuality. It took a wide range of very real symptoms, which could have been caused by anything from anxiety and panic attacks to epilepsy or heart disease, and attributed them to a uniquely female and specifically sexual organ. It created a framework where a woman's health was fundamentally linked to her reproductive function and her relationship with men. The idea of the wandering womb faded with improved anatomical knowledge during the Renaissance. However, the concept of hysteria as a catch-all diagnosis for women's unexplained medical and psychological problems persisted for centuries. In the 19th century, neurologists like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris studied hysteria extensively, though they no longer believed the uterus was physically moving. It was reimagined as a disease of the nervous system. Sigmund Freud would later transform it into a psychological condition rooted in repressed memories and sexual conflicts. It was not until the 20th century that the diagnosis of hysteria was finally abandoned by mainstream medicine, its myriad symptoms reassigned to more specific neurological and psychiatric conditions like conversion disorder, anxiety disorders, and epilepsy. The myth of the wandering womb is one of the most striking examples of medical sexism in history. It shows how a whole category of human suffering can be misinterpreted through the lens of gender prejudice. What does it tell us about the history of medicine that for 2,000 years the default explanation for a woman's complex symptoms was to blame her own body, her own sexuality, and a phantom, traveling organ? How many women with serious, treatable diseases were dismissed as merely hysterical? And what modern medical myths, perhaps more subtle but just as pervasive, are we currently perpetuating about certain groups of people based on cultural biases rather than scientific fact? Number one, what if the most powerful medicine was believing you were being cured? We have looked at a world of strange and often dangerous treatments, draining blood, drilling holes in skulls, applying leeches, and reciting charms. Many of these remedies were physically useless or actively harmful, yet medicine survived. People continued to seek out physicians and healers, and in many cases, patients genuinely felt better after receiving these treatments. How is this possible? The answer may lie in the most mysterious, powerful, and timeless medicine of all, the placebo effect. The placebo effect is a phenomenon where a person experiences a real improvement in their condition after receiving a sham or inert treatment simply because they believe it is a real treatment. The word placebo is Latin for I shall please. In the medieval context, almost every single medical encounter was drenched in the ingredients that we now know create a powerful placebo response. Consider the role of the physician. In the medieval period, a university-trained doctor was a figure of immense authority. He was learned, he could read Latin, he understood the secret and complex workings of the humors and the stars. His very presence was reassuring. He would perform a detailed and impressive ritual examining the urine in a special flask, consulting an astrological chart, asking solemn questions. This ritual itself was a powerful form of suggestion. It sent a clear message to the patient: your problem is understood by a wise authority, and a powerful solution is being prepared. The treatments themselves were often dramatic and intense. Bloodletting was a tangible, visible, and often painful procedure. The patient could see the blood leaving their body. Cautery involved fire and the smell of burning flesh. Aetheriac potion had dozens of exotic and expensive ingredients, and it tasted potent and strange. These were not subtle interventions. They were powerful sensory experiences that screamed, something significant is being done. This very drama could trigger the brain's own healing mechanisms. We now know that the placebo effect is not just in the mind. It can create real, measurable physiological changes. Believing you are receiving a painkiller can cause your brain to release its own natural pain-relieving chemicals, called endorphins. The expectation of a cure can modulate your immune system, reduce stress hormones like cortisol, and lower your blood pressure. The medieval patient who felt a sense of relief and hope after a visit from the doctor was not imagining it. Their brain was likely initiating a real chemical cascade that made them feel better. This effect would have been amplified by the shared cultural belief in the medical system. Everyone, from the king to the peasant, believed in the four humors. This shared worldview created a powerful context of expectation. When you got sick, you expected the doctor to rebalance your humors, and you believed that this would work. This collective belief would have made the placebo response even stronger. The placebo effect helps to explain why so many ineffective and dangerous treatments, like bloodletting, could persist for centuries. A patient with a fever might be bled. The fever, being part of a self-limiting viral illness, would have broken on its own in a few days anyway. But because it broke after the bloodletting, both the patient and the doctor would attribute the recovery to the treatment. This creates a powerful feedback loop of confirmation. The successes are remembered and credited to the intervention, while the failures are blamed on the severity of the disease. The placebo effect is not a relic of a superstitious past. It is a fundamental and active part of modern medicine. It is the reason why new drugs have to be tested in double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. The new drug has to prove that it works better than a fake pill that the patient believes is real. And in many of these trials, the placebo group shows a significant improvement, sometimes almost as much as the group on the real drug. The placebo effect is the ghost in the machine of medieval medicine. It was the invisible, unacknowledged ingredient in almost every cure. It forces us to ask a profound question: what is a real medicine? If a sugar pill, given with conviction and received with hope, can relieve pain and change body chemistry, in what sense is it not real? How much of the effectiveness of modern medicine is due not just to the active ingredients in our pills, but to the elaborate rituals that surround them: the sterile doctor's office, the white coat, the complex medical terminology, the expensive prescription? And if the most powerful healer is the belief system within our own minds, are we doing enough to harness this incredible innate power in our quest to heal the human body?